It was then, okay. But I mean, this is irrelevant. And I looked at McDonald's attorney, I said, aren't you going to object to this? And no response. So that was the first case where I really had a wake-up call. That's how I became involved in the movement 27 years ago, what have you. And then the next case was the Franklin cover-up case. And in that case, I had a call from a fellow named Ed Weaver in Lincoln, Nebraska. He had read about me in a book called The Ultimate Evil. Maury Terry, the author of The Ultimate Evil, who did a book on the Son of Sam murders in New York City, a series of murders that was satanic also, by the way. And Maury came to me on the West Coast, and I helped him do some of the research. A long story there, but I won't go into it. But anyway, Ed Weaver in Lincoln, Nebraska, called me. We have a problem here. We have a case that's breaking in Omaha. They're taking children out of orphanages, foster homes, in Boys Town, driving them to Sioux City, Iowa, 184 miles away, putting them on private jets and flying them to Washington, D.C. for sex orgies with congressmen and senators. And these kids were being flown back there, these 8, 9, 10-year-old children, exposed to these nefarious activities, these horrible situations. And I was told by Ed Weaver that some of the most prominent individuals in Omaha, Nebraska, and they're named in John DeCamp's book, The Franklin Cover-Up, and I'm out of them, by the way. I got one left, and I promised that to somebody. But you can order it through my website, tedgunderson.com, or you can come to my table afterwards, and you can order it then. But the Franklin Cover-Up, John DeCamp, who was the senator working on this case, wrote this book, The Franklin Cover-Up, documents everything. He names the people. Harold Anderson, past publisher of the Omaha World Herald. Bob Wadman, chief of police at the time. The head of the society page of the Omaha World Herald. The heir to the Brandeis fortune in Omaha. Eugene Mahoney, head of the Nebraska Forestry Service, ex-cop with the Omaha Police Department, Vice Squad. They're named in this book. And in addition to this, the kids talked about satanic cult activities. They didn't say they were satanic cult, but there were humans in robes, nude underneath the robes, chanting, candles, sacrificing animals and children and people, which is very common, by the way. In this country today, as a result of the work that I've done the last 28 years, I can tell you without any question there are 50 to 60,000 human sacrifices by the cults, satanic cults in this country every year. Okay? There are hundreds of thousands of children who disappear every year because of the satanic movement in this country. But anyway, that was part of the Franklin cover-up case. It was kind of interesting because there's a lot more detail than I can tell you, but as I said, this morning I was interviewed for an hour and discussed the whole case for one solid hour. But it was kind of interesting because to show you the power that these people have, there was a TV crew from Yorkshire TV came over, and for 7 months they were in this country interviewing various people. Paul Bonassi, who was a victim himself. Paul Bonassi, I've got a 5-hour interview with Bonassi myself, by the way. He's a mind control victim. The CIA is involved in mind control programs. And Paul was used as a decoy when he was 10, 11, 12 years old to attract other children near the car in parks and shopping malls and so forth. The adults would grab them and throw them in the back of the car and they'd be off with them. Johnny Gosch in West Des Moines, Iowa was a victim of this. Paul was involved in that kidnapping. Anyway, I have a 5-hour interview with Paul. It's available through my DVDs, and I'm giving away DVDs, by the way. And I'll talk to you a little more about that at the end of my lecture. And so Paul was, I've interviewed Paul, I've interviewed Alicia Owens, and this TV crew from England came over. We couldn't get anybody in the United States to touch this. And so Yorkshire TV came over, 7 months, interviewed all these various kids and so forth. And so it was listed, this show was listed to be aired in TV Guide May the 3rd, 1994. Actually in the guide. There were certain members of Congress found out about it, bought up the rights to the show, ordered all copies destroyed, and it never aired on TV, on national television, although it was supposed to be listed to air on the at 10 p.m. May the 3rd, 1994. Now, here a couple of years ago, I said, well, I've got to get a copy of the TV guide. And John DeCamp had one. He can't find it now. I think somebody stole it from him, to be honest with you. I got to get a copy of the TV guide. So I ordered a copy of the TV guide. Here's a page. I'm looking at it right now on May the 3rd, 1994. It's not listed there. It would not listed there in the copy that I have. It's called Balance of Nature, appeared at 10 o'clock on Discovery Channel. So somebody took that TV guide, that whole book, and had it reprinted so there was no documentation of it. Well, I outfoxed them. I went to the UCLA library, I went to the LA Times library, and I pulled up the TV guide for May the 3rd, 1994. It's listed. Conspiracy of Silence. That was the show. And I said to myself, well, maybe on the East Coast it wasn't listed. I had a friend of mine check the Philadelphia Inquirer, May 3rd, 1994. Conspiracy of Silence, 10 p.m. It's listed there. So that just shows you the power that this Illuminati has, that they do have. The speech last night by Mr. Griffin, I think was an excellent one. I enjoyed it. I knew a lot of that information, but he kind of expanded on it and helped enlighten me. As an outgrowth of the Franklin cover-up case. By the way, the FBI's involvement in the Franklin cover-up case. John DeCamp, in his book, The Franklin Cover-Up, Chapter 14 is devoted to the FBI's involvement in the case. And in that chapter, I read it, and I was embarrassed for the organization that I once served in and for. And John said, of all the agencies that tried to stop that case from going forward was the FBI. And for documentation, John has a $1 million judgment against Larry King. This is the head of the Franklin Savings and Loan, Larry King, not Larry King Live. This is a black man. And John has a $1 million judgment against him. He's standing on a street corner one day in Lincoln, and a stranger walks up to him, stands next to him, and says, if you ever collect that money, you won't live to spend it. John, one day, decides he has to move from Lincoln, get out of town. He's receiving death threats. Two young punks drove up into his front yard in front of his oldest daughter, drove over the family dog back and forth several times, told the daughter, tell your daddy to back off or we'll be doing this to you and your brothers and sisters. So John moved out of Lincoln to Clatonia, Nebraska. The case is very involved. As I said, I worked with John and I worked with the Nebraska Leadership Conference. I was, on one occasion, had to meet somebody in Omaha. Omaha is about 55 miles from Lincoln. I was in John's office on a Saturday morning at 9 o'clock. I called, made an appointment at Bohemian Cafe in Omaha to meet this individual. I drove up there, met him about noon. We were going to do some work on the case, going out and check on some kids that were victims of this horrible situation. By the way, this is how they tell the congressmen and senators how to vote, right? They blackmail them through sex and drugs. So we had lunch, and I went in the car of my source, my contact. We went out and did some work, came back at 3 o'clock. I left, actually a little after 3 o'clock. And halfway to Lincoln, I'm driving along at 75 miles an hour, and my right front wheel comes off. And all of a sudden, the car goes like this, lurches forward, falls to the right. I look off to the right, and here's my wheel spinning about 15 feet in the air. Fortunately, I was able to control the car. We had the car hauled off and talked to Highway Patrolman about it. He said, hey, somebody loosened your lug nuts. And also on the left front tire, when we had it hauled in for repair, the man said, hey, some of these lug nuts are loosened here, but apparently whoever did this was interrupted. But John was not too happy about it. I called him immediately. Instead of asking me how you are, Ted, he said, how's my pickup truck? Well, of course, he was concerned about me also. As a result of the Franklin cover-up case, we learned that there's an organization, we meaning John DeCamp, Ed Weaver, and I. And but before I leave the Franklin cover-up case, let me tell you, Gary Caradori was the investigator before I came along. He was a former highway patrolman. The official photographer of the people, of the group, was a fellow named Rusty Nelson. And I spent quite a few hours with Rusty. In fact, I spent about 2.5 months with him on one occasion. Rusty was recruited out of a gay bar in Omaha. And he was a country boy, never saw the bright lights of the big city to speak of, almost not a real metropolitan town, by the way. It's all right. Kind of an overgrown country town. And so they recruited Rusty to take pictures of these activities that were taking place in Washington, D.C., and that's, of course, how they framed them. And Rusty was pretty smart about it, because they kept control of the film that Rusty had, but he would sneak his own film in every once in a while. He'd take his own pictures, so he had a double set of pictures, and he did this for, obviously, his own life insurance policy. And so Gary Caradori was contacted by Rusty. This is just before I came aboard. And Rusty said he'd meet him in Chicago. Actually, Rusty at that time was in Phoenix, Arizona. And he met him in Chicago, gave him these pictures of some of our top political figures having sex with children. Gary and his little 11, 12-year-old boy flew to Chicago on his own private plane, got the pictures. He called Senator Lawrence Schmidt, who was working with John DeCamp, and he said to the senator, "I have the smoking gun." And he got on his plane and shortly out of Chicago in Aurora, Illinois, his plane blew apart, and a farmer testified he saw a bright flame, and the plane crashed, and Gary Caradori died. The first officer at the scene was a deputy sheriff, and he picked up the pictures that were strewn about on the ground, and the FBI came along and told him, "Let me have those pictures." They confiscated the pictures from him, told him not to talk about it, and the plane was hauled off to a military base. And now, Gary's a civilian. Should have gone to a civilian base. It was hauled off to a military base. The briefcase was never recovered. The back seats of the plane were never recovered. I tried to get my hands on that plane for about 6 months, and they wouldn't let me have it. But I suspect that the reason the back seat was missing is because that's probably where the bomb was. I'm sure the farmer says there was a flash, there was an explosion. The official version of the National Transportation Safety Board was the plane fell apart in the air. Okay, they do that all the time. What was it, Wellstone? His plane crashed too, didn't he? That's one of their favorite ways of getting rid of these people. Airplane crash, automobile crashes. Catherine Sorensen on the Franklin cover-up case, who was the first complainant, she had a pattern of taking her foster kids on the same route to school every morning. And this one particular day, after she filed the complaint, she's driving along. She comes up behind two little old ladies doing 5 miles an hour on a 2-lane highway. At the last minute, the two little old ladies cut off to the right, and a car comes 70, 75 miles an hour and hits her dead end, head in. And, of course, she died. So they got rid of her that way. Anyway, as an outgrowth of the Franklin cover-up case, we learned that there were kids being kidnapped in Washington, D.C. I'm telling you very briefly about this case. I really got a lot to cover, and I can't cover it all. You can get it on my DVD, so. So in 1987, March of 87, there were 2 adults and 5 young children who were noted in a park in Tallahassee, Florida. The adults were very well dressed. The children skimpily dressed. The police went down and talked to the kids. They said they were on their way to Mexico for a smart school. The kids didn't know how to use telephones, didn't know how to use the toilet, said they were living in the van, and they were only being fed when they weren't being fed on a regular basis, only being fed when they would behave themselves. And the van was traced to Washington, D.C. The 2 men were very well dressed. And long story short, the Metropolitan Police Department, Washington, D.C. obtained a search warrant on this was an organization known as the Finders. And they learned that from the search warrant that there were children being kidnapped by this group. They were being transported all over the world. There was information in their computer about terrorism and explosives and bank transfers. They talked about children from China and Hong Kong and from the Middle East and from Europe and so on and so forth. They also talked, the Metropolitan Police Department said that there were indications that there had been some satanic